Thank you for start recording. That was what I was asking for. So guys, welcome. Thank you for being here for this presentation. So presenting here, Allan is the student that I'm mentoring this year, and the project is related to improving our language features to work around and improve the tools we use to manage the translations inside Rocket.Chat. So I will not present the whole problem because Allan did a good job in the presentation. He will cover how it works and the solution and everything else. So everything that maybe it's not covered, we can cover. I can cover later or so through the questions. So I guess Allan, welcome. Thank you for your presentation. Please, stage is yours to start talking about your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Rodrigo. And let's get going. As he said, I am Allan. Today, I came to talk about my Google Summer of Code project, which is Language Power Tools, a command line application to help in Rocket.Chat's internationalization features. Oops. Okay, so going global, making an application global is hard. It's not only a matter of finding customers worldwide or of making a scalable, highly available application, but also of ensuring every user has a nice experience. And that is especially hard when that user might be anyone in the world. You have to make sure the app is going to work fine and deliver a good experience, no matter if the user is in South America, Eastern Asia, or any other place. And while it may be easy for us developers to use several types of applications, even when it's a big, complex app like Rocket.Chat with several different features, lots of settings and such, that might not be entirely true for the average user, especially when the app is not in their mother language. As this graph shows, there are several countries where only about 20% of the population or so speaks English. So if we want to deliver a good experience for users in these countries, it's very important that the app is translated, and of course, well translated to their languages. And that's where internationalization comes in. For those of you who don't know, internationalization is the process of translating an application to different languages. And how that works, basically. You have a translation string that you are going to feed into a translation API. For example, the translation string user_settings. That translation API is going to query the translation file of the language that you want. Portuguese, French, Spanish, English, whatever. And then it's going to give you back a translation for that string. In that case, in Portuguese, it would be configurações do usuário, something like that. And so in our case, in Rocket.Chat, we use a JavaScript library called Internationalization Next, and those translation files are JSON files that are stored in each project. So what's our internationalization status right now? How does our situation look like? We have about 92 translation files across the three main repositories, which are the web, mobile, and desktop projects. About 66 different languages supported, and over 4,600 translation strings in the biggest translation file, which is the English translation file for the web application. So it's a quite big operation, dozens of files, thousands of translations, and such. And this can get quite hard to manage quite fast. So what are the main problems we are facing with internationalization in Rocket.Chat right now? First is strings that are removed from the codebase. Imagine the following situation. You have implemented a feature that is going to use some translation strings and such, and you add those translation strings to the translation files. But later, for some reason, that feature is removed from the application. The feature is deleted, and as a developer, as a human who makes mistakes, you forget to remove the translation strings used from the translation file, so they remain there silently untouched. What's the problem with that? It may sound like not harm in the beginning, but you have two problems. The first small problem is that might make your translation files grow indefinitely. You are adding several strings there and not removing, and they get bigger and harder to manage. But the second and more important problem is that eventually Rocket.Chat might want to pay professional translators to translate the app to another languages. And those translators get paid by the translation. So if we have translations in the translation files that are not being used, we are we are going to be wasting our money. We are going to pay these people to translate strings that aren't even going to be used at all. So we want to have the minimum uh, translation strings in the files that aren't going to use it, preferably zero. On the opposite, there are strings that lack translation. For example, imagine that this time you implemented a feature but forgot to add the translation strings to the translation files, or you don't know that the translation strings lack translations, and that might lead to a bad experience for the user. The app is not going to be correctly translated to their language, or it's going to be partially translated, and we don't want that either. And evolving translations. For example, we could make an effort right now to make the app 100% translated to, I don't know, 10 languages. But later, we want to ensure that standard is maintained. Rocket.Chat is an open source application, and we are receiving contributions from developers from all around the world. So we want to make sure these contributions adhere to the translation standards. We want to make sure the translation evolves along with the software and our quality standard is maintained. And finally, the development process in regards to internationalization is quite manual. For example, the translations are stored in JSON files. So everything about translation you need to look up on those files. For example, if you want to know if a string has a translation or not, you have to open the file, hit Ctrl F, search for the string, and such. If you need to add a translation for a string, you have to open the file, add the translation, and such. And that can become quite boring or unproductive, and we don't want to hinder the development experience. We want to make internationalization to be smooth to work with. So, okay, internationalization is hard, internationalization is important. How can we fix it? How can we make it easier? There's where my project comes in, Language Power Tools, also known as LAM2. As I said earlier, it's a command line application which has the goal to make internationalization easier, offering a set of tools or commands that is going to help in the development process in regards to internationalization. You will be able to add new translations interactively. So instead of having to open the JSON file and edit it, you can just call learn2 translate and it will get all the untranslated strings for you and you can translate them. Of course, you don't have to translate all of them. You can skip the ones that don't matter to you. You can quickly get a report progress on the translation of each language. So instead of having to inspect each file one by one, checking this by yourself, you can just call learn2 report and get a quick answer on how things look like for each language being translated. You can get information about specific translation keys. So If you're developing and you need more information on a given key, for example, you expected the key to be translated, but you're not quite sure if it's available or if it's available in a given language, you can just use learn to find and get information about that key instead of having to search for it in the code base. You can also quickly find keys that are missing by using learn to find untranslated, and it will get you a list of the keys that lack translation, which can also be quite useful. And of course, there are some features still in development, but that are also very important, which is Github CI integration. As I said, it's very important to keep a translation standard on new contributions. So we are going to add a command on the tool to check for internationalization quality on pull requests. For example, checking if a given code is using translation strings and not literals. Check if the translation strings the code is using exist in the translation files and such. And detecting unused translation strings, because we don't want to have unused translation strings in the translation files, so we can remove them safely. And finally, some of the challenges I faced in development. First, the CLI environment. I believe most of us, when first learning to program, have developed some basic text-based apps and such, but when it comes to a serious production level command line application, not everyone has the opportunity to work on these kinds of applications. For example, I am most used to the web environment. I never developed a command line application like Lantu serious application that is going to use in production before. And so I wasn't very used to the environment. I didn't have any experience with the libraries. So it was something that I had to search for a while. And even then, after I made my decisions, I was not quite sure if I made the right ones. For example, did I pick the right library? Because I began facing some problems with it, some accidental problems. It started throwing a lot of bugs, didn't integrate really well with TypeScript. So this was something that bugged me for a while and that I'm still getting the hang of. And a poor decision that I made in the beginning was the way I chose to handle dependency injection. Uh, if anyone doesn't know, dependency injection is a design pattern where you inject the dependencies of your classes through the constructor or through a container so you can switch them easily in test environment, or if you want to use polymorphism and such. But the really important thing that is that it makes your classes less coupled. So the way I chose to handle dependency injection was using a DI library called siderange, and I decided to always inject interfaces rather than implementations, which sounds like a nice thing because you have less coupling by talking to an interface rather to an implementation, but that comes with a price. To inject interfaces in siderange, you cannot use the class annotations like singleton, injectable, and such. You have to inject them manually. You have to call container.register instance and your class. And that was getting quite messy to manage because I had to make these calls when the app started up, and I had to make sure all the dependencies were injected. And then in test environment, it was even worse. I had to make sure I injected all the mocks, implementations, the fakes, and such, and it was getting quite messy, quite convoluted. And the whole point of doing this was to make testing easier, so I could inject the fake implementations. But it wasn't getting any easier. It was getting harder because I had to make sure all the fakes were injected. So what did I did instead? I started talking to the implementations themselves, and instead of injecting fakes in test environment, fake implementations, I just stubbed the methods. I don't know either if this is the best approach, but in terms of development experience, it has been working better than what I did before with the interfaces. So that was basically it. Thank you guys for your attention. If anybody has any question, now would be a nice time. Since we got some time remaining, I could even demonstrate Ubuntu working.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan. That's a great project. I guess that will help us to raise the bar of the project in terms of translations. We really want to have some official translated languages in Rocket.Chat that are 100% translated. So this will be even more important for the community to contribute and ensure that they are translating everything that we consider important for the project, or we know better on our side which translations we need to contribute to that contribution to make sure it's ready for production. Well, we have a question here for Hankumar.
Yes.
Also an idea, is this very specific to Rocket.Chat or can be extended to any other project with some configuration?
Well, as I am going to use a code parser that is made to parse Internationalization Next code, that is code that uses the library Internationalization Next, the project could be adapted to any other project that uses this library. So it can be basically any project. But as it is right now, it only works with Rocket.Chat because it has to find the translation files and it relies on the structure of Rocket.Chat's projects. So if you just clone the repository, it wouldn't work out of the box with other projects, but you can quickly mess up with it and it would probably work fine with Internationalization Next projects.
Yeah, just adding some information on this answer. Our idea is to at least the tool works on all of our projects, the mobile, the web, the Electron application, because we will standardize the library used to translate. That was one of the first tasks for this project, was to define what library you would make this project on top of, because then we standardize all the other projects. Today, we're not using the same library, same format of JSON files to translate all the projects. But we already decided we want to have a standard there. So as Alan mentioned, since it was made on top of this standard using the i18, what's the name of the library?
Exactly that. i18 Next.
i18x.
I find it easier to just say Internationalization Next.
Yes, Internationalization X. So yeah, that's what Hankumar said. So every project that use that and just maybe have some extra configuration in the future can use these tools on CI, etc.
Kumar asked, what library did I use? So Internationalization Next is the internationalization library that Rocket.Chat uses. It's the library that manages this process. It's the library that offers this translation function, but it's not the library that I actually used. The library I used to build the CLI was Oakleaf, which is a library built by the guys from Heroku. And there are several command line libraries available in NPM. But the reason I chose Oakleaf specifically was because it seemed to offer a more robust tool set. For example, they've had a very thorough documentation on how to do several things. And while the other libraries like Commander and Vorpal, they look leaner, they look less pretentious. Their documentation wasn't quite complete either. So I felt Oakleaf would be the safer call. And while I had some problems with it, I still don't regret picking it. I guess it was indeed a good choice. And there's another thing that Oclive uh, expects you to work in a more object-oriented approach, while the other libraries have a more functional philosophy, more declarative. And
You guys have another question here from Yash.
yeah.
How are we checking for unused translation strings?
Okay, so to check for unused translation strings, we use a library that parses internationalization next code and gets a list of the translation strings being used in a given file. So you would have to parse the files that matter for that matter to get the list of translation strings being used. And then once you have the list of translation strings being used, you have to match that against the translation files to see which strings are in the translation files but not being used in the code base. So then you find out which strings aren't used. But there's a problem. The library is only able to detect the strings being used if they appear in the code base as literals. If they are used dynamically, for example, being queried from a variable or an array, an object, or something, the library won't be able to infer what string is being used there. So that's a problem we are facing and coming up with solutions to.
Yeah, cool. So I guess we don't have any more time for questions. We have a next presentation in a few minutes. So I want to thank you, Allan. It was a great project, great time in work together. Even that you did almost everything alone, I wasn't able to give you that much attention. So that was really, really great to see you evolving on this for yourself. So thank you for your participation. It was great. So thank you, folks, for being here, and let's see the next presentation in a few minutes. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. See you in the next presentation.
Ending the session, everyone please be there.
I will end the recording, so it will start.
Sing, your voice is still low. Singer's voice is still
okay.
low.
I have the mic fight. Okay, turning it off. Bye.